Please be seated. Well, good morning. Lovely to see all of you here this morning, and especially those new faces who are new and visiting here for the first time, maybe the second or the third time. It's good to be here. I wanted to start my sermon today with this question that Jesus has asked, which you may be familiar to you, where he says, "Who do people say that I am?" Because that's the question that's been running through my mind over these last several weeks with the gospel passages that we've had. You may remember Jesus asked the disciples that, "Who do people say that I am?" And the only person who gets it right is Peter. Who is Jesus? Sometimes I think we hold in our minds these passive images of him. Jesus as the gentle storybook picture of the Good Shepherd, usually white, serene and tranquil, a lamb resting across his shoulders, looking out over a pastoral landscape, usually kind of fuzzy in the picture. So that's one image I think that comes to people's mind. Or here's another one, the Jesus who kind of stands above it all, never in the fray, detached, apart. I like to call this the Buddha-like Jesus, roaming about, making wise comments about things, deeply prayerful, but somehow apart and above things, and never taking definitive stances. But when I read these texts lately from Matthew, the texts that we've been having in our lectionary, over these past Sundays, these images just don't resonate with me. Because lately, what we've been seeing of Jesus in Matthew isn't tranquil or apart, but fully engaged. Jesus in the middle of the fray. Jesus fully immersed in the back and forth banter with the scribes or the Pharisees or anyone who wants to challenge him. And Jesus clear about what it means to love God, clear about who's invited to the table, clear about who's blind and cannot see. In these passages we've been having lately, Jesus hasn't been neutral or detached in those gospel readings. Last week, he was right there in the middle of things about taxes and about loyalty to Caesar. Just before our passage today, he's going at it with the Sadducees about resurrection and what that means. And then today, the topic is how to interpret Torah. He's being challenged on that. And so he's arguing back with the Pharisees. A lawyer, a Pharisee, comes to Jesus and he asks him, "Jesus, which commandment is the greatest?" It wouldn't have been an unusual debate for the educated elite to have, which one is the greatest, to parry over which of those 613 commandments was the most important. This actually was how they did theology, to turn something over and over again to get at a deeper understanding of God's word. Entire schools grew out of such debate. And I find myself sometimes wishing the Christian church would be willing to sort of engage in the same and not be afraid. But this lawyer, in asking that question, he's really not about Jesus's answer per se. He's more about just trying to show Jesus up. It says so in the text. He wants to entrap Jesus in front of the crowds who might be giving their loyalty to Jesus, in front of Jesus's disciples, in front of the other Pharisees. But he fails miserably because Jesus answers him directly and straightforwardly in a way that makes clear Jesus is here to play. He knows Torah as well as any of the rest of them. And Jesus says to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Both parts of what he said come from the Torah, the first 5 books of Hebrew scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The first one, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, as Jesus said, although in the Hebrew scriptures it's might, but Jesus changed that to mind, is from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 6:5 to be exact. It's what's known as the Shema, which means to listen, something every good Jewish person would know was at the heart of Torah. Not that surprising an answer from Jesus. And the second part wasn't so surprising either, although maybe a little bit more so. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's from the book of Leviticus. And it was part of what's called the Holiness Code, which begins by saying, be holy just as God is holy. Imitate God and you will come to know holiness. It's a lot like the saying, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Be holy as God is holy. And then Leviticus gives a whole series of things to do that make up holiness, including the one that Jesus draws from. You shall not seek vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there's also this, which wouldn't have been that far from Jesus's mind, but there's this from Leviticus in that same section. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field. You shall not strip the vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien, for the stranger. You shall keep those edges full for whoever is in need. In both these instances, loving God, being holy, is connected to how we engage the world, how we engage the people that we have conflict with, how we attend to the poor, the stranger, how we look at the margins, how we understand our own resources and what we share of them. Jesus is drawing deeply on those precepts in the Hebrew scriptures, and he puts his final exclamation mark in front of the Pharisees when he declares, on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Meaning, it's pretty simple. Everything you need to know is right here. Clearly, he silences them. They don't have a response. And then he comes back and he parries with them on his own questions. And it's about this point in the story, if you go back and read chapter 22 and you realize how much Jesus is getting challenged, you're just starting to get the feeling that Jesus is about to blow. Go back and read it. It's sort of time after time. He keeps giving answers and they keep coming back. And all those times that he answers, he's kind of engaged, but with a certain kind of reserve, a certain holding back, but you're just starting to feel like he's had it. He's right on the edge and he's about to break, and he does. He does. In chapter 23, the floodgates open, and we get this whole series of woes and recriminations, and they're relentless from Jesus. Just a taste of some of what he says in chapter 23. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do. They do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. They love to have the places of honor at the banquets and the best seats in the synagogue. Woe to you, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of Gehenna as yourselves. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. Woe to you, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and indulgence. That's probably a quarter of chapter 23, but Jesus goes on with this relentlessness, and you really do see this shift. He's sort of taking it, and then he just cuts loose. This isn't the calm and tranquil Jesus in our minds. He's direct, he's clear, he's unrelenting. Naming hypocrisy, naming self-aggrandizement, power that works for its own good, oppression. He's naming all those things just for what he sees them being, not detaching from it, but engaging it and calling his disciples to do the same. And so that brings us back around to us, followers of Jesus. There is much hard and difficult in our world right now. Every week, difficult news. And it's not just 1 week. You think this week is really difficult, and then you move into the next week and more news. It's easy, I think. It's tempting sometimes to just want to detach, to withdraw from it, because it's too much. Because you don't think it will make a difference to be engaged, because you think there's nothing you can do, or maybe you think you're not responsible for any of it, it's out of your power. You think that it's just enough, it's enough to take care of your own life. And sometimes, frankly, it's just too hard and it's just too much to take. I appreciate all of those sentiments, and I resonate with them maybe more deeply than you might imagine. But I also realize how easy it can be to detach, or to construct around ourselves worlds that keep us protected, worlds that are mostly focused on our own well-being and that of our tribe, whatever that tribe is, whatever group we belong to. And in a way, I sometimes wonder if that's what the scribes and the Pharisees and all those others challenging Jesus, if that's what they were about, just trying to hold on and protect themselves consciously or not. But the reality is Jesus won't let us look away, because he points us to a different reality. And it's a reality where God's holiness is integrally tied to this world, in this world, and the things that are right in front of us that present themselves to us. In our fields, as Leviticus might say, that demand, that cry out for a response to those edges, those things waiting at the margins for us to notice, if we will. This presents a very different way of thinking about God, because it brings God right down to here and asks us to open our eyes, to pay attention. Holiness becomes something not far off, something far off and apart that we can't achieve, but something tangible, even sacramental, that's built into this world. And so as I think about this understanding of holiness, I am wondering, like personally, but also for this community of faith, who is on the edge of our fields? And how wide are our margins of generosity? And what harvest is there on those edges to be gleaned? For them, for whoever's gleaning, but maybe even for us too. What richness do we have to give this world that has so many fraying edges? And where is our voice, our power to proclaim and embody God's kingdom right here and right now? Wherever it is that we find ourselves, wherever it is that we live and move and have our being, wherever that is. It doesn't have to be something big, but it has to engage us. These are important questions to be asking in these times. And I believe if we cultivate those edges, and if we enrich and tend to our fields, tend to our own spirits, then we will become, like the psalmist says, like those trees planted by streams of living water. We will find holiness and we will know it deep down because our heart will be where God's is. So I close with just a little snippet about something that awaits me next weekend, and it's connected, you'll see how. But next weekend, I'm officiating at the wedding of Deirdre Logan, who was a former acolyte here. Her family was sort of involved on the periphery, but their kids always acolyted, and on the Sundays they acolyted, they were always here. And she was in my confirmation class, lovely family. And so literally about 14 months ago, I got a handwritten letter from her, hadn't heard from her since she'd gone off to college and was working, telling me how much her time here at St. Matthew's meant to her, her being an acolyte, and asking if I would officiate at this wedding. And the funny thing was, she sent it in like September and asked for November, and I thought, oh my gosh, 2 months away, and I was already doing a wedding last November. But then I looked at the date, and it was literally for 14 months from now, the following November. So I got this letter, and next weekend I'm going to officiate at her wedding. And so I was looking over the bulletin that had been created for the wedding, and I noticed that there were 2 pieces of music that Deirdre had chosen to be included. And I think you'll at least be familiar with the first one. The first one is How Great Thou Art. How Great Thou Art. And then the second one is Let There Be Peace on Earth, which has this refrain, let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. It seemed like such a perfect pairing to me. God's holiness, how great thou art, and a peace that begins with me. A peace that recognizes our own engagement in making a reality. But really, it could be anything. You could fill in that with anything that's a part of God's kingdom. A peace that begins with me, a justice that begins with me, a nonviolence that begins with me, an open welcome to the stranger that begins with me, a mercy that begins with me, a cup of water for someone in need that begins with me, reconciliation that begins with me, whatever those virtues of the kingdom are that you feel called into. Whatever it is that engages this world, that holds out a vision for the kingdom of God, the one that Jesus proclaimed and then engaged in and fought for and embodied. Whatever that is, let it begin with me, with all of us.